Day 6 of 90 focused on functions fundamentals. The goal today was making functions fundamentals feel like clear values, collections, and function boundaries instead of syntax trivia. I did not want a framework tour. I wanted a model I could still explain after the demo code grew into a real application. The first concrete check was value shapes that stay obvious at a glance. That sounds small, but it decides whether the code reads like a contract or like a lucky sequence of framework calls. The second check was control flow that makes coercion visible. That is usually where bugs start if the edge of the system is vague, because bad assumptions leak deeper into the app before anyone notices. The third check was small function boundaries with explicit input and output. Once that was visible, make values, arrays, objects, and function inputs say one clear thing about the data they represent. That is what made the lesson feel reusable instead of tied to one tutorial example. The implementation only started to feel solid once used control flow and standard library choices to make valid transitions obvious. In JavaScript, that usually means the runtime, modules, and async boundaries all need to agree about who owns each decision. I kept returning to one more rule: prefer small explicit data shapes over clever abstractions that hide the real meaning. That is the part that shortens debugging because the code tells you where to look instead of forcing you to reconstruct the intent from scratch. The predictable mistakes were leaning on coercion or mutation until the value flow stops explaining itself and writing control flow that technically works but hides which states are actually valid. They look different on the surface, but both come from letting convenience win over clarity. So my recap for day 6 is simple: making functions fundamentals feel like clear values, collections, and function boundaries instead of syntax trivia. Keep value shapes that stay obvious at a glance, control flow that makes coercion visible, and small function boundaries with explicit input and output visible, and the code stays much easier to test, explain, and change. One reason I keep drilling these days is that production changes usually alter the surface area, not the core contract. If the contract is clear, the refactor stays local instead of infecting the whole project, and that is a much better place to be when release pressure shows up. That is especially true in JavaScript, where browser state, node services, middleware, and background work can all make the code look more connected than it should be. Clear ownership prevents the drift and gives you a much smaller search space the first time something breaks. A lot of debugging time disappears when the request path, async path, or data path is obvious from the structure. The language and framework help, but only if the design is honest and the boundary is visible in naming, types, and flow. My test is simple: could I explain this same design tomorrow with a different example and still keep the same reasoning? If yes, the lesson probably landed for real. If not, I probably memorized a recipe instead of understanding the trade-off. I also ask where the next teammate would hesitate. That question usually points at the first boundary that is still implied instead of stated, and cleaning that up early is almost always cheaper than doing it after 2 more features land on top of it. When the code is shaped well, the UI boundary, modules, handlers, and logs tell the same story. When they do not, the mismatch shows up in review before it shows up in production, which is exactly where I want the correction to happen. That is why I keep practicing with one concrete path at a time. A small path is enough to reveal whether I understand the design or only recognize the tooling around it, and that is a much better signal than just getting the sample app to run once. The pattern I am looking for is repeatability. If I can take the same boundary, reuse it in a slightly different context, and still trust the behavior, then I know the lesson moved from recognition into working engineering judgment.